They did not lower their voices when they decided her fate. In a chandeliered drawing room, beneath gilt frames and ancestral oil portraits, the conversation passed over her head as though she were a piece of furniture long grown shabby and overlooked. Teacups chimed, silk skirts whispered, and her mother's tone carried the brittle calm of someone arranging flowers for a funeral. It was settled with a nod, a glance, a thin smile of satisfaction. She would go in her sister's place, not as a bride sent with hope, but as a lesson delivered with precision. She stood by the tall window as rain traced slow, accusing lines down the glass. The city beyond looked blurred and distant, like a life she was no longer permitted to touch. Her reflection wavered there, pale and composed, her mouth set in a manner learned through years of endurance. They called her plain when they were being kind, and worse when they were not. She had learned to hold herself as though dignity were a shawl she might draw tighter when the room turned cold. Her younger sister wept prettily on the chaise, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the relief of escape. It was not cruelty that made the girl sob, but fear of inconvenience. The Duke's proposal had arrived like a summons from another world, one ruled by stone estates and ancient names, and the family had trembled at the thought of displeasing such power. Someone must be sent. Someone must pay. And so the unwanted daughter, the quiet one, the one with no prospects worth guarding, was chosen without ceremony. She accepted the decision aloud with measured calm, surprising them all. There was no protest to dramatize, no collapse into tears to stain the carpet. She inclined her head and said she would prepare at once. Inside, something shifted, not breaking but hardening into resolve. If she was to be offered as penance, she would at least arrive intact. The journey north unfolded beneath a sky the color of lead. The carriage rocked through rain and mud, wheels groaning like old men bearing secrets. She watched hedgerows blur into stone walls, then into open land, feeling each mile loosen the grip of her former life. Her dress was modest, her gloves worn thin at the fingertips, yet she sat upright, hands folded, as though posture alone might preserve what little honor remained to her. When the Duke's estate finally emerged from the mist, it rose not with warmth but with authority. Towers cut the sky, their silhouettes sharp and unyielding. Iron gates opened with solemn reluctance, admitting the carriage into a courtyard swept clean of welcome. The house seemed to observe her approach in silence, withholding judgment, waiting to see what sort of offering had been delivered to its steps. Servants received her with professional reserve. Eyes flickered, assessments were made, conclusions drawn and quietly shared. She was shown to a small guest chamber far from the grand staircase, where a single fire burned low. As her cloak was taken, she felt the weight of the house settle around her, heavy with expectations she was never meant to fulfill. Downstairs, conversation moved like a current she could not yet enter. She sensed it in the pauses, in a way footsteps slowed near her door. The Duke had not been informed of the substitution, or so she had been told. Whether this ignorance was strategy or carelessness, she could not know. Only that she had been sent to stand in another woman's place, bearing a name that was not meant for her lips. At dinner she was not invited. A tray arrived instead, arranged with polite efficiency. She ate little, listening to the distant echo of voices and the muted clink of crystal. With each sound came the reminder that her presence was provisional, her future already a topic of speculation. That night, alone in the bed, sleep came fitfully. She lay listening to the house breathe around her, timbers settling, corridors sighing with drafts. Thoughts pressed in uninvited. Of her sister's relieved smile, of her mother's composed indifference, of the careful cruelty that had dressed itself as necessity. Shame threatened to rise, but she met it with the discipline she had learned as a girl. Shame, she knew, could only thrive when granted permission. By morning, whispers had begun their work. She sensed them in the altered tone of servants, in the glances that lingered too long before sliding away. Word had traveled that the Duke had not dismissed her outright, that he had chosen delay over correction. Delay, in a house like this, was dangerous. Delay invited curiosity, and curiosity fed judgment. She understood then that her trial had only begun, and that survival here would demand more than acceptance. When she dressed, she chose simplicity over display. The gown was plain, the color subdued, yet it fit her well, honoring her form without apology. As she pinned her hair, she caught her reflection and felt an unfamiliar thought stir. If she was to be examined, let her at least stand honestly before the gaze. So when the summons came again, it did not strike her as a threat, but as a turning slow tide. Later, as evening deepened and rain softened to a hush, she was summoned at last. The message was brief, delivered by a footman who avoided her gaze. In the long gallery, candles cast wavering light across tapestries of conquest and inheritance. She walked beneath them slowly, aware of her own heartbeat, of the faint tremor in her hands. The Duke stood near the hearth, his figure composed and still. He was taller than she had imagined, his bearing marked by restraint rather than arrogance. When he turned, the room seemed to pause with him. She lowered her eyes at once, bracing for the practiced dismissal, the polite confusion, the moment when the error would be corrected and she would be sent away like an unopened parcel. But it did not come. His gaze rested on her, without haste, without the quick calculation she knew too well. There was no flicker of disappointment, no narrowing of interest. Instead, something unreadable crossed his expression, a quiet attention that unsettled her more than scorn ever could. He did not speak immediately. In the silence, she felt herself seen, not as a mistake, but as a presence. "You have traveled far," he said at last, his voice even, measured, carrying neither warmth nor chill. It was an observation, not an accusation. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her tone steady despite the sudden awareness of her own breath. Another pause followed, laden with possibilities. The fire snapped softly. Outside, rain continued its patient fall. When he inclined his head, it was not dismissal, but acknowledgement. "Then you must be tired," he said. "We will speak more tomorrow." As she curtsied and withdrew, her pulse quickened with a confusion she could not name. She had not been rejected. She had not been unmasked. And behind her, in the quiet of the gallery, the Duke watched her leave with an expression that suggested the evening had delivered something he had not expected at all. Morning arrived with a pale, disciplined light that crept through tall windows and settled upon the stone floors like an unspoken question. She rose early, dressing with deliberate care, aware that every choice would be read as intention. When she entered the breakfast room, conversation faltered. Teacups paused midair. She felt their curiosity sharpen, not cruel yet, merely hungry. At the head of the table, the Duke acknowledged her presence with a measured nod, offering no explanation to the others, and in that silence, something quietly shifted. No one asked her questions. The omission felt intentional, a courtesy edged with danger. She noticed how the Duke's gaze returned to her at odd moments, not lingering, but precise, as though he were assembling a truth from fragments. When a servant offered her sugar, he intervened quietly, stating she preferred honey, a knowledge she did not recall sharing. The remark was small, almost trivial, yet it landed with force, sending whispers rippling through the room. Throughout the morning, she sensed herself becoming a subject rather than an error. Invitations followed, subtle and unmistakable, a request to walk the gallery, a place reserved beside him during accounts. Each gesture unsettled the household. Respectability wavered. The staff obeyed, the guests observed, and she struggled to interpret kindness without mistaking it for spectacle. Her family's intention had been humiliation, yet here, something more dangerous stirred, something like possibility, and it frightened her more than rejection ever had. The Duke spoke to her that afternoon in the library, a room heavy with leather and history. He asked about her journey, her reading, her thoughts on the estate's tenants. His questions were measured, but attentive, as though her answers mattered beyond courtesy. She answered honestly, resisting the urge to diminish herself. When she spoke of fairness, of quiet endurance, His expression softened, and she wondered what part of her words he recognized as familiar. Later, a gift appeared in her chamber, a slim volume of poetry, its margins worn with age. No card accompanied it, yet she understood its sender. The verses spoke of restraint and patience, of love deferred until it could be honored. She traced the lines with careful fingers, feeling both chosen and exposed. Such a gift invited interpretation, and interpretation invited scandal. Already, she could sense the household recalibrating, adjusting to a reality none had anticipated. At dinner that evening, she was seated at the Duke's right hand. The placement alone was declaration enough. Conversation strained under the weight of pretense, and every laugh rang too loudly. When a guest remarked upon the unconventional arrangement, the Duke replied calmly that comfort, not custom, guided his household. The statement settled like dust after a fall, quiet but impossible to ignore. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from being publicly claimed as worthy of consideration. Whispers followed her through the corridors afterward. Some speculated cruelty, others amusement. She heard her sister's name spoken with relief, her own with incredulity. Alone later, she wrestled with gratitude and fear, unsure which posed the greater risk. To hope was to invite pain, yet the Duke's actions refused dismissal. He had not corrected the substitution. He had not retreated. Instead, he advanced with quiet insistence, drawing her into a narrative she had never imagined for herself. The following day brought its own trial. A letter arrived from her family, its tone falsely concerned, warning her not to presume upon kindness. The implication was clear: remember your place. She folded the letter with care, placing it away like a relic of another life. When the Duke encountered her in the garden moments later, he noticed her pallor and asked if she was unwell. She answered truthfully, and in doing so, crossed an invisible line between propriety and trust. He did not press for details, but his presence shifted, becoming protective without being possessive. As they walked, he spoke of responsibility, of the cost of obedience without conviction. She listened, recognizing a shared wound. In that exchange, brief and unguarded, she felt the balance tilt. She was no longer merely enduring circumstance. She was being invited to participate in it. The realization unsettled her, for participation carried consequence, and consequence demanded courage she was not yet certain she possessed. That evening, as candles were lit and the house settled into expectant quiet, she understood the shape of the conflict before her. Acceptance here would mean defying the story written for her elsewhere. Rejection would restore safety, but at the cost of something newly awakened. When the Duke requested her company the following night, his tone formal yet deliberate, she felt the final certainty dissolve. Whatever had begun could no longer be undone, and she stood at the threshold of a choice that would alter everything. In her chamber, she removed the borrowed finery and sat by the window, watching moonlight trace the gardens below. The woman who had arrived as punishment felt distant now, almost unfamiliar. She sensed that the Duke's interest was not whim, but recognition, and that recognition carried its own peril. Tomorrow promised explanation or exposure. Drawing a steady breath, she prepared herself for a reckoning neither of them could fully foresee, knowing that his next words might either unmake her or crown her fate. Beyond the glass, the estate slept unaware of the quiet rebellion stirring within its walls. She pressed her palm to the cool pane, steadying herself against the pull of fear and anticipation. If she remained, she would be seen. If she fled, she would vanish into safety. Somewhere below, a light still burned in the Duke's study, a silent answer to questions he had not yet asked aloud. The night held its breath, waiting for dawn to decide who she would become. She did not know whether destiny had mistaken her name, or finally learned it, but she sensed that the world was watching now, and that she could no longer hide from its gaze at last. The evening he chose for privacy arrived without ceremony, as though the house itself wished not to announce what was about to change. Rain pressed softly against the windows, blurring the world beyond the glass into shadow and silver. She was summoned after supper, not by servant, but by a folded note left upon her dressing table, written in a disciplined hand that betrayed nothing of urgency. The request was simple: the small sitting room adjoining the library when the clock struck 9. She spent the intervening minutes pacing, then forcing herself to stillness. Her reflection showed a woman composed to the point of fragility, her expression calm but guarded. She chose a gown of muted blue, neither modest to the point of apology nor bold enough to invite comment. Tonight, she sensed, ornament would only distract from what must be said. The sitting room was lit by a single lamp and the low fire in the grate. The Duke stood near the mantel, one hand resting upon the carved stone, his posture formal yet not closed. When she entered, he turned at once, as though he had been listening for her step. He did not offer his hand, nor did he bow. Instead, he waited, granting her the dignity of approach rather than command. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not awkward, but deliberate, a pause that allowed the truth to rise between them unforced. She felt the weight of it settle in her chest, heavy yet clarifying. When she finally met his eyes, she saw not curiosity, but resolve. "You were not sent here by accident," he said quietly. The words landed with precision, not accusation, but acknowledgement. She felt her breath tighten, then steadied herself. "No, Your Grace." He nodded once, as though confirming something long suspected. "I have been informed," he continued, "that another was intended." She did not look away. "Yes." The fire shifted, sending sparks upward. Outside, rain intensified, a muted applause for confession. He studied her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every inch of herself, not in vanity, but in vulnerability. She waited for judgment, braced for dismissal cloaked in courtesy. Instead, he surprised her. "They believed," he said, "that substitution would humiliate you." Her fingers curled at her side. "They believed correctly." "Yet," he replied, "you arrived without resentment." She allowed herself a small, honest smile, one that carried weariness rather than pride. Resentment would have required hope. "I was sent with none." That, she saw, struck him. His composure shifted, ever so slightly, as though a carefully arranged interior had been disturbed. He gestured toward a chair, inviting her to sit, and took the opposite seat himself, the small distance between them charged with unspoken meaning. "I have known," he said after a pause, "what it is to be valued for the wrong reasons." She regarded him, then, with new attention. In the quiet intimacy of a room, the Duke appeared less monumental, more human. Lines of restraint marked his expression, the result of years spent fulfilling expectations he had not chosen. She felt an unexpected kinship stir. "I am sorry," she said softly. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, not gratitude. "So am I," he replied. "For you." The words were gentle, yet they pierced. Emotion pressed behind her eyes, but she held it back, refusing to let it spill uninvited. "You need not be," she said. "I have endured worse than misunderstanding." "I do not doubt it," he answered. "But endurance is not justice." That sentence altered something fundamental. She had endured all her life without anyone naming the injustice of it aloud. The recognition felt dangerous, intoxicating. She leaned forward slightly, compelled by a courage she did not fully understand. "Then why keep me here?" she asked. "Why not correct the error and send me home?" His gaze did not waver. "Because I do not believe in an error." Her pulse quickened. The room seemed to contract around them, the air thick with consequence. He continued before she could interrupt, his voice low, deliberate. "You were sent as punishment," he said. "But punishment implies guilt. I see none." The simplicity of the declaration undid her. She drew in a careful breath, steadying herself against the swell of feeling. "Seeing is not the same as choosing," she replied. "No," he agreed, "but it is the beginning." Silence returned, deeper now, layered with all that had been said and all that had not. She sensed the edge of something irrevocable approaching, and fear rose alongside hope. "If I remain," she said, choosing her words with care, "I will be judged." "You already are," he said evenly. "As am I." that more than anything bound them. He rose then, moving to the window, gazing out into the rain as though seeking counsel from the night. When he turned back, his expression held a gravity that stilled her completely. "I will not pretend," he said, "that this path is simple. There will be scrutiny, opposition, consequences. I'm familiar with all three," she answered. A flicker of something like admiration crossed his face. He stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, but near enough that she felt the warmth of him. "Then hear me," he said. "I do not offer protection as charity. I offer regard." Her heart stumbled. Regard was not rescue. It was acknowledgement, respect, the promise of equality. She had never been offered such a thing before. Before she could respond, a distant sound echoed through the corridor. Footsteps approaching, unplanned and intrusive. The moment fractured. He straightened, composure snapping back into place. "We will continue," he said quietly. "But not tonight." She stood, understanding the necessity. As she turned to leave, he spoke once more, stopping her with a single sentence that reverberated through her entirely. "They intended to break you," he said. "Instead, they revealed you." She left the room with her heart unsteady and her future altered, knowing that whatever followed would demand more than endurance, and that the next choice would no longer be made for her. The morning of the ball dawned brittle and bright, as though the sky itself had been scrubbed clean for judgment. She stood before the mirror while maids adjusted silk and lace, feeling less adorned than armed. Every ribbon fastened was a question, every pin a reminder that tonight would decide how far regard could defy society. The house stirred with anticipation, corridors murmuring with speculation that grew bolder with each passing hour. She sensed eyes upon her long before she entered the ballroom, felt judgment sharpen like glass beneath perfume and candlelight. When she crossed the threshold, conversation faltered, as though the room inhaled and forgot how to breathe. The Duke waited near the center, composed in dark evening wear, his expression unreadable yet resolute. He did not offer his arm immediately, allowing the pause to speak louder than ceremony. When at last he did, his hand was steady, deliberate, an invitation extended not to possession, but to partnership. They moved together across the floor, while the orchestra began, the music unfolding like restrained confession. She felt every gaze track them, measuring, comparing, waiting for misstep or mockery. Yet the Duke danced with careful ease, neither showcasing nor hiding her, as though the space they occupied belonged solely to them. Whispers followed their turns, swelling into speculation when his hand tightened subtly at her back. A lady nearby let her fan snap shut. Another tilted her head in open appraisal. She kept her chin level, heart racing, refusing to apologize for occupying the light. When the dance ended, applause rippled uncertainly, and the Duke did something no one anticipated. He did not release her at once. Instead, he addressed the room, his voice calm, yet carrying each word placed with intention. "I have heard," he began, "that my household thrives on tradition. It is time," he continued, "that it learns discernment." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that signals fracture rather than peace. He turned then to her, not as spectacle, but as equal, and offered his arm once more. Together they withdrew from the floor, leaving behind a room buzzing with uncontained reaction. She felt the weight of it press upon her spine, but his presence anchored her. In a quieter antechamber, removed from prying eyes, the Duke finally exhaled. "That was necessary," he said, not asking forgiveness. "You will be criticized for it," she replied, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "I am already," he answered. "Tonight merely clarified the matter." He studied her then, with something like fierce respect. "You could still leave," he added. "No one would question it." The thought struck her with surprising clarity, yet held no allure. She had been sent away once already. Retreat now would only confirm the story others preferred. "I will stay," she said, the words grounding her. His response was immediate, though carefully restrained. "Then we proceed," he said, with honesty. In that promise lay both shelter and storm. They returned to the ballroom briefly, enough to be seen leaving together. By morning, the narrative would be set beyond repair. Her family's punishment had become a provocation. Later, alone once more, she removed her gloves and stared at her hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of consequence. She understood now that dignity could be claimed, not granted. Outside, carriage wheels departed into the night, carrying gossip into the world beyond the gates. The Duke remained awake, a presence she felt even through walls. Tomorrow would demand explanation, alignment, perhaps sacrifice. As she extinguished the candle, she accepted the truth forming within her. She had not been chosen despite her being sent as punishment. She had been chosen because she remained. That realization steadied her more than any vow. Whatever awaited, it would not erase her. And somewhere between defiance and devotion, the Duke had made his position unmistakable. Sleep came slowly, threaded with images of light and judgment. She did not dream of escape, but of standing still while the world shifted around her. When dawn approached, she knew the moment for secrecy had ended. What followed would be public, irrevocable, and shaped by courage rather than compliance. She rose with that knowledge burning steady in her chest. In the corridor beyond her door, footsteps paused, then moved on. The house held its breath again, sensing change. And far below, the Duke prepared to answer questions that would alter them both. He would be asked about propriety, lineage, intention. She would be measured for silence, gratitude, obedience. Neither role suited the truth they had uncovered. The confrontation loomed, inevitable as the rising sun. Yet beneath the dread ran a current of fierce anticipation. For the first time, she would not enter it alone. She dressed again with intention, selecting restraint over concealment. The woman in the mirror no longer appeared expendable. Whatever title awaited her, she would not beg for it. Downstairs, voices gathered, sharpened, prepared to divide loyalty from curiosity. She paused at the head of the stairs, hand resting briefly on the banister. Her pulse was calm. This was not the posture of a woman sent as punishment. It was the stillness of someone prepared to be chosen aloud. And as she descended, she felt the story bending toward a declaration neither fear nor convention could silence. At the foot of the stairs, the Duke waited, already engaged in quiet argument with expectation. He looked up when he sensed her presence, and in his eyes she saw no retreat, only resolve. Whatever he intended to say next would not merely answer society, but define them both. The room hushed as though anticipating a verdict. She stepped forward, knowing that the moment he spoke, punishment would finally lose its power. Whether it would be replaced by love or by open war remained unanswered, trembling between them as the future drew breath. She lifted her chin, ready to receive whatever name he chose to give her before the world listened closely. The room had gathered itself into a single breath by the time the Duke spoke again. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, illuminating faces arranged in polite expectancy. Relations, advisors, guests who had stayed expressly to witness the correction they assumed inevitable. She stood beside him, hands loosely clasped, her posture neither defiant nor deferential, but calm in a way that unsettled those who mistook composure for compliance. "My friends," the Duke began, his voice carrying without strain, "I have been asked, by implication and by inquiry, why I have not amended what some consider an error." A murmur rippled, quickly stilled. He did not glance at her as he continued, as though her presence required no defense. "It has been suggested," he said evenly, "that the lady at my side arrived here under circumstances unworthy of her." A few heads inclined in agreement. She felt the familiar chill of judgment brush her spine, then pass. She had endured colder. "I do not dispute the circumstances," he went on. "I dispute the conclusion." Silence fell again, sharper now. He turned to face her then, fully, and in doing so shifted the room's axis. The movement was unmistakable. This was no preamble to retreat. It was alignment. "You were sent," he said to her, though the room heard every word, "because others believed you expendable." Her pulse beat once, strong and steady. They believed, he continued, that by offering you in another's place, they could satisfy obligation without cost. He paused, allowing the truth to settle. They were mistaken. A stir of discomfort moved through the assembly. Someone coughed. She felt the Duke's presence beside her like a steadying hand without touch. I have spent my life, he said, turning back to the room, being offered admiration for titles, alliances for advantage, and obedience mistaken for affection. I have learned to recognize the difference. His gaze swept the gathered faces, lingering nowhere, challenging everyone. What I see here is not substitution, but revelation. Her breath caught, though she did not falter. He had named it aloud. The word changed the air. Therefore, he said, I will not correct what you call an error. I will honor what it revealed. The weight of that statement pressed down like thunder. Shock registered openly now. Eyebrows lifted, lips parted, calculation exposed. She heard a whispered protest, quickly swallowed. The Duke lifted his hand, forestalling interruption. I'm not finished. He turned to her once more, and this time his voice softened, though it lost none of its authority. You were sent here without expectation, he said. You remained without entitlement. You stood before judgment without apology. He extended his hand, not upward, not commanding, but level, inviting. And in doing so, you showed me a courage I have not often encountered. The room seemed to tilt. She stared at his hand for a heartbeat that felt like a lifetime. In that pause lived every version of herself she had been taught to abandon. The quiet girl, the overlooked woman, the one expected to make herself smaller so others could remain comfortable. She did not shrink. She placed her hand in his. The contact was brief, restrained, yet it resonated through her like a vow spoken in another language. A collective intake of breath followed, sharp and unmistakable. I choose her, the Duke said simply. The words were neither dramatic nor embellished, yet they struck with irrevocable force. Some faces hardened, others softened. A few turned away, unwilling to be seen, witnessing a moment they could not undo. She will remain, he continued, not as charity, not as compromise, but as my intended. The declaration shattered any remaining pretense. Voices rose at once, concern, outrage, hurried counsel, but the Duke did not engage. He had said what must be said. The rest was consequence. She stood amid the uproar, strangely calm. The fear she had anticipated did not come. In its place was a quiet, grounding certainty. Whatever the cost, she would not be erased again. Later, when a room had thinned and argument had retreated into corners, they found themselves alone in the antechamber where the night before had promised reckoning. The aftermath lingered between them, heavy but clean. You need not answer now, he said quietly, releasing her hand at last. I have spoken my intention. Yours remains your own. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of expectation. She found none, only regard, steady and unguarded. I am not accustomed, she said slowly, to being offered choice. Then take your time, he replied. I will not rush you. She considered him then, not the Duke as the world knew him, but the man who had seen her without reducing her to circumstance. If I accept, she said, it will not be as gratitude. He inclined his head. I would not have it so. And if I refuse, she continued, testing the boundary, you will be scorned. Yes, and I will be spared. Perhaps, he said, but not by me. That honesty sealed it. She felt the last of her hesitation loosen, not because he had removed risk, but because he had named it. She stepped closer, closing the distance with intention. I was sent here, she said, to be endured. He listened. I will not live my life as an endurance, she finished. If I remain, it will be as myself. A smile touched his mouth then, brief but unmistakable. Then remain, he said, as yourself. The days that followed unfolded with measured resolve. Opposition persisted, predictably loud, but the Duke did not waver. Invitations were withdrawn, alliances strained, yet something else occurred alongside resistance. Curiosity gave way to respect. Those who observed her closely found no artifice to condemn. She moved through the estate with quiet authority, neither performing gratitude nor courting approval. When the formal announcement was made, it carried less shock than expected. The world, it seemed, had begun to adjust itself. On the morning she was presented as Duchess in waiting, she stood once more before the mirror. The woman reflected there wore no crown, bore no new finery beyond what she had already earned. Yet her eyes held a steadiness that had not been present before. She was not transformed by title, but confirmed by choice. The Duke met her at the threshold of the great hall, offering his arm without ceremony. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant more than the moment required. As they stepped forward together, the murmur of the assembled crowd faded into a single, sustained hush. The past, the punishment, the substitution, the shame, fell away behind her like a garment outgrown. She did not look back. Later still, when the house had quieted and evening settled into gentler shapes, they stood side by side at the window overlooking the gardens. Lanterns glimmered below, steady and warm. "They will speak of this," he said, not regretful. "They always do," she replied. He turned to her then, expression thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" She considered the question with the care it deserved. "No," she said at last. "For the first time, I was chosen aloud." He nodded, as though the answer confirmed something he had known. Outside, the night deepened, holding their silhouettes against the glass. Tomorrow would bring new scrutiny, new trials, new expectations. But tonight belonged to a truth spoken and received without disguise. She had been sent as punishment. She would remain as promise. And somewhere beyond the walls, a world accustomed to deciding women's worth would learn, slowly and reluctantly, that it had misjudged her entirely.